Good afternoon and welcome to the Free West Media YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed to us yet, please do so as we've got many interesting conversations coming up. And today I'm privileged to be talking to Chris Hart. He's an economist with Impact Investment Africa, and he was previously also at various banks, I think. Good afternoon,
Yes.
Chris.
Good afternoon, Dave.
Well, is there hope for our topic is there hope for the South African economy? And you think there is, as long as we do a couple of things right.
No, exactly. There's certain things we need. There's certainly hope, but to achieve that hope, we need to and realize the hope. We realize we need to see what is holding the country back from a point of view, and I think there's three big uh, events, and a lot of people focus on what are called the little policy things. For instance, like labor laws. Should we have a minimum wage? I actually don't think that's the biggest factor, to be quite honest, in terms of why we have the unemployment rate that we do. Um, uh, I believe the most fundamental thing is that you have to lift the investment rate. And I think the National Development Plan has that. But we've had a falling investment rate over the last several years, in fact, last decade. Right. And that falling investment rate has really subjected the country to what I call almost depression conditions. And when I say depression conditions, the growth rate's below our population growth rate. We are uh, rising unemployment with falling per capita incomes, I think may well be the recipe for depression, and we've seen that in the last minimum 10 to 15 years. And we need to understand for a prosperous economy, and when an economy has these factors in place, and a lot of prosperous economies, you can't look at what they're achieving now and say, if we do that, we'll become prosperous. In fact, a lot of them have receded into mistakes that has led to them. The reason they're prosperous is because of a historic um, factors rather than current factors. And we can see this. A country like the UK, which is languishing at the moment, even though it's supposedly a wealthy country, but they're making plenty of mistakes. And we can look at South Africa. If we go from 1994, you could say the economy did quite well up until about 2007. In 2007, there was a switch that was turned in the economy because it was this what I call the second leg to fall. But the first leg fell, and in both instances we've had unusual external circumstances that have hidden the actual policy mistakes that we've made. And the first big shoe to fall was in 2001. And you can literally name the date that, for instance, the mining industry went X growth. In other words, no further growth in the mining industry. And that was when the charter was thrust on the, the, the economy. And we need to understand
Well, was then that then a black economic empowerment charter?
that was the Black Economic Empowerment Charter. Now, I think within South Africa, we have a very nice discussion as to um, how we've got to deal with the legacy of apartheid, and we understand that. But from an external point of view, it's actually very difficult. Sorry, it's actually very difficult for outsiders to understand the intricacies of BE laws, right, which are imposed nowhere else in the world, right? So it's a peculiarity. Yeah. The reason is that there's three important factors that you need to have a prosperous economy. One is the freedom to associate and the freedom to contract uh, in in a free environment. In other words, the moment you have to have a politician standing next to you in a deal, that is a very, very bad sign. Okay, if you and I wanted to do a business deal, it's because we see the commercial merit of doing business with each other as opposed to somebody else. That's probably one of the most critical things. And the moment we see BEE in place, that's what we call is financial repression, where the state is actually saying you can't deal with that person, you've got to deal with somebody else, and directing capital to where it wouldn't normally naturally flow. So that's the first critically important leg. And I think in South Africa, we got over that, and we've been dealing with it because of the legacy. And internally, we understand that discussion. Externals don't understand that discussion. After 2001, every single global mining company saw South African assets as their orphan assets in the portfolio. And you've seen it. BHP Billiton has divested themselves of South Africa. They've set up another company. But the gold mining industry, for instance, a lot of marginal shafts, it wasn't worth people carrying a marginal shaft through the downturn because they don't see a long-term future. So it was just shut, right? And the gold mining industry went into decline. This whole thing was hidden by the commodity boom at that time. So South Africa did quite well. We reached 5% growth rate at points, which for South Africa was a boom. But when you compare South Africa against emerging markets and sub-Saharan Africa, from 94 right through to 2007, South African economic growth rate was below the average by about 1.5 percentage points on average for that period, right from 1994 right through to 2007. And why the average is important is because I often say if South Africa could only achieve mediocre, we would be doing so much better as a country. But the first leg was the imposition of BEE. In other words, you couldn't transact freely on the most commercially optimal basis that you could find. There's certain things, certain parameters that you had to meet.
If I could interrupt you there, I mean, normally people say that in the early 2000s, we had such good growth because of Trevor Manuel, the finance minister at the time. So you're saying that it was actually being masked.
It was masked by the commodity boom.
By the commodity boom, which makes a lot of sense.
It was masked by the commodity boom because during that period, South Africa still underperformed the average. In other words, I'm not comparing the best performers or anything like that. I'm just saying the average, what was easy to achieve, what the average was achieving, we were not achieving that. All right. Even though we had investment, it was not in the mining industry per se. And other industries, as the charters were rolled out, they went ex-growth. And that's a major thing. The second big shoe to fall was in 2007. And again, 2007 was masked by the global financial crisis in 2008. But the moment the prosecuting authorities made the decision that we're dropping the charges against Zuma, right, they effectively at that moment, the constitution was broken. In other words, the institutions, etc., that gave us confidence in the system, even if we didn't like the government, it didn't matter. But the system was broken. And to keep the charges away, what that meant is that they say, we've got a justice system which is arbitrary, right? Politicians get impunity, all right? And we saw that. And we saw that the corruption at that point shifted from skimming to wholesale plunder, all right? And that was, that we need to understand. From 2007, up until 2007, the underperformance of the economy was about 1.5 percentage points below the average. The additional underperformance was an additional 2 percentage points from that point on till the present, right? So we're now growing at about 3.5 percentage points below what was being achieved in sub-Saharan Africa and also the emerging market peers. In other words, it doesn't matter what you're doing in our region. We're the laggard in our sub-Saharan Africa as in emerging markets. When you're comparing Colombia and Thailand and Chile and Argentina, Turkey, etc., all of these countries, we now 3.5 percentage points below. Now, remember, over a long period of time, this is a compounding effect, right? That is devastating. If we actually just had achieved the average from 1994, not doing anything, in other words, we're still doing some policies that are restrictive on the economy, basically, we would have been almost 3 times the size, economic size now than what we are, muddling along at this at sub 1% growth, in the last decade and a half. And our unemployment rate would be under 8%. We would be a much more prosperous country. But the dropping of the charges were, again, an additional factor. Now we've recently had the hullabaloo around the budget, and everybody calls it a growth budget. It's the exact opposite of a growth budget, exact opposite, because it's the same thinking that we've seen. And the next shoe to fall is the expropriation without compensation. So a prosperous economy depends on the ability to contract at the most commercially optimal way that players see at the time. Second is, if you do have a contract, you can enforce the contract, and that there's the rule of law. It's not an arbitrary system where some people, can and other people don't need to comply with the law. And then the third thing is property rights. And the property rights is the most obvious anti-growth measure that you can have. All right. And even, as I said, the misinformation that farms aren't being taken, there's a selective. You can have 1 or 2 isolated examples, and I agree that farms and property in general haven't been expropriated up until now. But Zimbabwe could also say in 2000, we haven't taken any farms. But, a year down the line, the story is very different. And the point is, why do you need a law that allows expropriation without compensation? And that's not misinformation. How can you misunderstand without compensation?
Yes, and if you look at some of the recent pronouncements by Paul Machatile, the deputy president, I mean, they seem to say that they are going to use this law. They want to use it.
Well, the point is, the first place they want to use it is in the Johannesburg city centre, where there's so-called abandoned buildings, and it just looks like just the right thing to do. All right, but a lot of the buildings were abandoned because the buildings were invaded, and the owners could not get recourse through the law. And that's the point about the ability to enforce the law, is that if you have an investment into a building and you get and the law gets transgressed with trespassers, etc., you can actually get redress. Okay, the law is enforced and the trespassers are evicted, but not in South Africa, right? And sometimes because the politicians are involved in the hijacked building, they're getting a cut or something, which is why you don't get enforcement of that. But that is an allegation. I would say I would have no specific proof, but it's certainly rumors that one would hear. So when I say, is there hope in South Africa? If we take away expropriation without compensation and we restore the rule of law, and that, in other words, actually act on the Zondo Commission, for instance, and politicians that have been involved in corruption actually go to jail, right, or certainly is convicted, and there's some penalties that are imposed, and that we allow the optimal commercial contracts to be made. In other words, the free association with people without enforcement of that, there's a lot of hope for South Africa. All right. In other words, South Africa can bounce back extremely quickly. We've got the capability, the capacity, etc. Very strong institutions still that exist that can actually take us through, right, and see and enable growth. We just take, and then there's what I call some of the rats and mice legislation. Things we've stopped talking about exchange controls. All right, that we're moving towards abolishment of exchange controls. my guess is if we abolished exchange controls in 1994, the financial services sector would easily be 3 times the size of it is now. But because of exchange controls, people do business, and from a financial sector point of view, they're external. How much business has been externalized to Dubai and Mauritius and the Cayman Islands, etc. You can do this business in South Africa, but that part of the business must be externalized because of exchange controls. It just is chasing investment away, right? And the only purpose that exchange control serves, there is no other purpose of exchange control other than to shield bad policy. Because if you've got good policy, you don't need
But don't you
exchange controls.
think exchange control is also there because the state and the politicians actually want more control over people's lives, and it's kind of being used as a stick to beat people?
The exchange controls is also used to help enforce taxes, right? Which is why they don't want to get rid of it. It's an amazingly effective way to make sure, when we say effective, as I say, from a double accounting and all the rest of it point of view, that you can cross-check to make sure SARS did not lose out, all right? And that's a problem that you have, because when we then look at the tax regime that we've got, okay, and I would go back to the thing where we had Trevor Manuel was, I think, a highly respected finance minister, and I agreed, but he did one huge disservice to South Africa. Right, there were actually 2, but the biggest disservice to South Africa is he introduced capital gains tax. All right, and why I say that's the biggest disservice is because there is no emerging market that can justify capital gains tax. There isn't a single one, because effectively what capital gains is that you're actually looking to tax capital, right? And that is your very resource that you need to fund the growth that you need. All right. So when you actually look at structural growth, when you actually say we need to build more stuff, right? We call it investment, but you could say you've got capital, which you use to buy more factories, you use to buy more infrastructure. You need to do that. And when you're taxing capital, you're converting capital into consumption, right? Which is the last thing that you need to be doing as an emerging market. There is no emerging market that can say, we've got such an abundance of capital that this is actually a wonderful pot to tax. Right.
When you say that capital gains tax converts capital into consumption, is that because that money then flows to the state and the state's going to spend it?
They're going to spend it on welfare, which is basically, if I can say welfare, and you can say, these days also corruption is a big part of the budget, but not specifically itemized. But the point is that they tax it, it's capital that's then get converted into consumption. All right, and we need the opposite. We need consumption, restraint, so that you can actually convert resources into capital. So when you have people talking about we need more, we need to have wealth taxes. We've already got 3 very, very nasty wealth taxes, and one is property transfer duty, which is the one way households accumulate capital, which is an important source of capital for small business, right, and startups. So property transfer duty, not a good tax at all. And then, of course, there's rates and taxes. It's based on the property. That's another wealth tax that's imposed. You've got death duties and you've got capital gains tax, right? So it really is a bad situation that we shouldn't be doing. It's like eating seeds. If a farmer eats seeds, he can't expect harvests. And when you eat the capital of a country, right, you can't expect growth. And that's what is missing. When I see the discussion amongst politicians, about how this is a growth budget, right? It's a growth in the spending of government, but it's not a growth. It's not an economic growth policy. It's not a jobs creating budget at all, because you're actually shifting resources to consumption, right? Which means you're crowding out investment. If you take a look at what I call, they say it's a pro-poor policy. What it is it's a pro-poor poverty alleviation budget. In other words, poverty alleviation is shifting resources to consumption, whereas poverty reduction is shifting resources to investment. Two very different things and not well understood. And when your poverty alleviation policies go too far, it actually is helping to create the problems of poverty, because you don't have the ability. The alleviation is crowding out the investment that should be taking place, because it's not like there's two separate pots. One pot has got investment money, and then the second pot has got consumption money in it. It's the same pot, and so when you take more for consumption, there's less for investment. It's just the standard thing of scarcity. So, when we're talking about economists. So if we want to try and get a growth budget, we've got to fix the three things. In other words, take away financial repression so that people can contract optimally. Secondly, restore the rule of law so that it's not an arbitrary thing when people feel like it or don't feel like it, but you actually can enforce contracts and people feel confident that the law will be applied, because that's an important part of investment. And the third thing, assure property rights. You've got to actually strengthen property rights, not weaken property rights. And those are the three things that need to be. And if you put those things in place, things like the minimum wage have it. I don't particularly, I'm ambivalent. I know it's not always the best thing, right? But, have these things, but put those three things in place and then focus on the budget to say, how can South Africa become more competitive? Is firstly, you've got to actually shift resources to the private sector, which means that you've got to cut the tax burden. I think there's a few things that we need to appreciate, that when we talk about taxes, we need to talk about not tax revenue. That is the connotation of that is that they earned it. It's the tax take. That's the right term to do it. It's the tax take. And it's not government services. We need to refer to it as the burden of government, right? And it's not to say that we shouldn't have a government, but we need to actually say we need to reduce the burden of government and reduce the tax take, right? So that resources are in the private sector hands where they're making commercial decisions, which is not the kinds of decisions that governments make. They don't have commercial criteria for their spending requirements. So when we talk about economic multipliers, government spending, right, has much lower economic multipliers than private sector spending. In the Keynesian model, you'd say if private sector spending in the economy is down, you boost it by government spending. And that might have been true in the 1930s, where government took 10 or 15% of the of the overall economy. The burden was actually quite low on the overall economy. But when you've got the burdens of government that are now sitting in the mid-30s% of an economy, some of them even higher. But in South Africa's case, it's about 33, 34%. It's an incredible burden that when you cut that burden, you're actually shifting resources from low multiply activity to high multiply activity. I'm not saying you end government. I'm just saying where the tilts in the budget must tilt so that you're actually shifting resources to the private sector. And in that case, you're also shifting resources to investment rather than consumption. So those are the two big factors I look at, when I say, is it a growth budget or not? And if you have a look at the commentary and what politicians are saying, it just doesn't. You can see across the spectrum, whether it's the MK or EFF, which is more daft, etc., but the loony left. But when you compare it, say, with what I call the sensible centre, I mean, you had the leader of the IFP going on on and on about how the rise in VAT is pro-poor. And you say, yes, it's pro, it might be in his mind something for poverty alleviation, but is creating the poverty you're trying to alleviate by increasing the burden of government. And that is, so if we get the right mindset, right, this country can reestablish itself as the leader in Africa in financial services. There is no country in Africa that can actually, sorry, in financial services, in fact, you can add the rest of Africa up and you won't even come up to what South Africa has in financial services, whether it's the pension system, whether it's the banking, insurance, you name it.
Yeah, and that would include Egypt and Algeria and Morocco and everybody.
You add the whole lot up, right? South Africa should be the biggest economy, but not by a small amount, by far. It should be double at least the next biggest economy, even if it is to Nigeria. And here we're battling. Are we in second or even third place behind Egypt, right, and Nigeria? And there's no ways we should be battling with that. We should be a much bigger economy, and you put the things in. You put the things in the right places.
In the past way ahead of the rest of Africa?
Way ahead. It was like, Egypt was like 10, 20, 30% of South Africa's economy. Nigeria, same thing. And now we're sort of battling, is Nigeria bigger? It depends on the exchange rate at the time, because that has a distorting effect, right? But ultimately, we shouldn't be in that position. We should be the biggest economy on earth. And so part of the BEE problem is that you are deploying cadres. It's you're not getting the best people in the job, which means that there's a functionality problem in the capability and capacity of key institutions in the country. These things can all be improved. And I do think that there is a model that we can use to rectify the past. And it has to be a growth one, not BE at the moment is a policy of economic transfer rather than growth. So you're doing the business, you're not allowed to do the business, somebody else must do the business. And when they've had enough turn, you pass it on to somebody else. That's economic transfer, it's not growth. What we need to do is follow maybe the Afrikaner example in the wake of the Anglo-Boer War, where, for instance, they look at Old Mutual, for instance, and they don't say we want to take over Old Mutual. They say we're going to set up Sanlam. They don't look at Standard Bank and say we want to take over Standard Bank. They set up Volkskas. In other words, they matched it. And what happened is that the economy grew. One can argue, is it the best or not? But that is the only way you can actually have a satisfactory BEE type of thing, where you're genuinely looking at uplifting the overall population and ending unemployment, for instance, and reducing poverty and inequality. But this is, the situation that we've got now is leading us into a dead end. But where the hope is that the people leading us into a dead end is now 40% party. It's actually 39.7% party, 159 seats in parliament. You need 160 seats to be a 40% party. They're just one seat short of a 40% party. The municipal elections are coming up. I would not be surprised to see ANC support in Gauteng, for instance, at the mid-20s because of the absolutely disastrous way. If I were to go 10 years ago, you could say, yeah, there was Cape Town's run better, but Joburg's sort of okay. When you say you go to Pretoria, sure, I would say you'd say it's a jungle out there because the jungle really is closing in, right, and taking over Pretoria. That was, the enduring feeling I get when I drive there is that the neglect is unbelievable, all right, and we can see that, and it's actually translating into support, and we're not seeing a radicalization of our of the electorate. It's actually ironically not radicalizing. They are looking for solutions, right? And unfortunately, our sensible centre can't even speak to each other because they see each other as rivals because they want to be King Kong in the sensible centre. So they're fighting the wrong battles, I think, in that
What would
sense.
you say is the DA's economic policy?
To me, they want to do prestige type of things. So concession report, for instance, let the Western Province government take control of the port and policing, etc. And that basically is a federalization type of policy. But I'm yet to see when a party says we want to support growth, the first two things I want to hear them talk about: how they're going to boost savings, because that's your capital formation, and how they're going to encourage that capital formation to be actually deployed into the economy as investment. So those are the two things I want to hear, and they're neglected. All right, and I agree with investment alone might not be enough, but it's a necessary component. You can have investment and education, or investment and technology, and investment and infrastructure, but you've got to have investment. Even in a communist system, an Islamic system, or a socialist system, a capitalist system, to bring new economic activity into existence, you have to have investment.
That's very true.
It doesn't matter what you are. Even the loony left in Stalin or Lenin, etc., to grow their system, you need investment. And if your system isn't creating the capital, and that's why I emphasize building savings. South Africa has a deep culture of savings, and I know our Minister of Finance say we don't have a culture of saving. What they're doing, they're criticizing us for not doing what they are making unviable. Right? When you save, you lose utility on your currency because you get taxed on interest, which is not really even covering inflation. Right? You're going backwards if you save, and that's the first wrong step. If we actually looked at our savings, our pension industry is an example of a culture of savings. Our stokvels, right, is not just savings, it's a culture of savings, right? And that's where we build capital, right? And we need to actually encourage that, right? So when we look at a tax system, it should seek to encourage the value chains to grow in the economy and not milk the value chains and truncate the value chains. We should always try and tax the end of the value chain rather than milk the value chain, right? And we don't see that. So, if I were to look at that, if you remember, GST was introduced in, I think, 1980 or 1981, and then it changed to VAT. The reason they did that is so that they could lower personal tax rates. In South Africa, it was 72%. In the UK, it was 90. It was above 90%. Can you believe it? In other words, if you earned above a certain amount, they took it. But by cutting taxes, right, it helped to set the platform for growth, right, through the 80s and the 90s. But what's happened now since is that they're raising both personal income taxes and the VAT rate. And I would say certainly support an increase of the VAT rate, right, so that you can cut capital gains tax, right. So I would support a rise in VAT to 12%, right, so that you can eliminate the capital gains tax, and you'll immediately say, but VAT is 15%. What I'm trying to illustrate by that is already VAT is way too high, right? And we shouldn't have capital gains tax, and we shouldn't have death duties, and we shouldn't have property transfer duties. We need to encourage investment into these sectors, and we need to encourage capital formation. And that a lot of tax law and taxes are conjured up by politicians and sometimes accountants that don't necessarily understand the economic implication. I've spoken to accountants and say, but if you don't have capital gains tax, people will shift their income into capital rather than to avoid tax. And I'm looking at it, that's exactly the behavior we want. We want more capital. We need it, right? And that's the distortion that we have to have, because we're sitting with an investment rate in the country of about 15% of GDP. It's barely covering depreciation, let alone anything spare for growth. We need to get that to at least 25% if we just want to try and achieve something close to the emerging market average, just average. But we need to get it above 30% to actually start to get a rapid fire decrease in things like unemployment and actually get the economy growing faster. And there are other things that we can do. For instance, we have to sort out access to capital for small, medium enterprises. The banks are no good, right? The financial services sector, fantastic as it is, you can raise billions, you can raise hundreds of millions. But if Safisa and Alexandra needs 500,000 rand for his plumbing business, there is nowhere for him to go, right, for that kind of capital. And that's the kind of capital that's needed to actually grow the economy, right, especially at a level where you want to have job-creating growth, is that we need to give our SMEs love. Right, the tax system is incredibly rapacious, especially to small businesses. One doesn't even appreciate. You start up a small business, the amount of, in the first 5 years to even get it to profitability is difficult, etc. And a lot of businesses fail. But the biggest beneficiary of a startup that fails is SARS, because by the time it's failed, they've sucked out an enormous amount of taxes out of that ecosystem, right, that people don't even appreciate. And we need to actually rectify that so that we can at least say, give a small company a chance to grow before we suffocate them. So is there hope?
Yes. Well, we're sort of running out of time, but I like your message, and I think you've got some very sensible proposals there. And maybe we should go into those another time.
Yeah. Very much so. Is there hope? Stop making mistakes. Start copying the best, right, and most successful, not on where they are now, but how they got there. And it was not by taxation. It was not by consumption. It was through investment and through low burden of government.